Throughout the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh has a habit of picking people who are not very confident in their abilities to do great things, and having them do great things as a way of demonstrating his own greatness. Some of the most famous examples of this are probably David, specifically when he fights Goliath, and Moses, specifically in the conversation he has when he encounters the burning bush. This video's subject, the judge Gideon, is in a similar position to those two, except while their stories end in glorious legend, Gideon's story is more niche and less well known compared to theirs. Hence why I am making this video, to tell you all about Gideon, the next judge of Israel. By this point, you should see a pattern popping up in the book of Judges. Deborah and Barak have passed away, and without proper leaders, the Israelites have slipped back into idolatry and worshipping other nations' gods. This upsets Yahweh, as it goes against the covenant the nation of Israel made with him back when they left Egypt, so he sends foreign nations to take over the Israelites again. This time, it's the Midianites. Fun fact, these are the same people who are descended from Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. The Midianites were so powerful that the Israelites had to hide in caves in the hill country and build fortresses to defend themselves from Midianite oppression. The Midianites specifically targeted Israelite crops and livestock, likely seeking to cause a famine in the area. The Israelites beg Yahweh for help, and by this point, he kinda gives the Israelites an earful. His response essentially boils down to, I saved you from Egypt on the condition that you follow me and me alone when you get to the land I promised you. But what do you do as soon as you're out of Egypt? You worship other nations' gods. Despite the scolding, the people continue begging for help, which Yahweh eventually provides in the form of Gideon. And let me tell you, of all people in Israel, Gideon was not the first choice of anyone to be a savior. The text says that Gideon came from the weakest family, in the weakest clan, in the weakest tribe of Israel, Manasseh. You might remember from the Deborah episode that Manasseh had the largest territory. That detail is noteworthy, and it should give you an idea that maybe not all the stories in Judges were written at the same time by the same person. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're focusing on Gideon's story today. Despite all that he had going against him, the angel of the Lord came to Gideon and greeted him, saying, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon looks confused and responds, "Mighty warrior, I think you have the wrong guy. Also, how is the Lord with us if all this bad stuff keeps happening?" Gideon and the angel of the Lord have this back and forth, where the angel insists that Gideon has what it takes to lead Israel to victory, but Gideon insists he doesn't, and that the Lord needs to choose someone else. Why does this sound so familiar? Gideon then decides to test the angel of the Lord. He brings goat meat and bread made without yeast in a basket. The angel of the Lord said to put them on a rock and pour broth over them, which Gideon does. The angel of the Lord then tapped the rock with a staff, and the whole thing was set ablaze. At that moment, Gideon realized he actually was talking to the Lord and shielded his face, fearing for his life because he thought he saw Yahweh's face, and any human who looks upon Yahweh's face will surely die. Except Moses, but he's the exception that proves the rule. The angel of the Lord then said that Gideon was fine because he hadn't seen Yahweh's true face, only the face of this angel. Gideon then set up an altar to worship Yahweh, but then Yahweh told him to tear the altar down. Instead, Gideon was supposed to build an altar of worship to Yahweh, where Gideon's father had previously built an altar to Baal. For those wondering who Baal is, the short answer is he was an ancient Canaanite god of storms who was worshipped before monotheism became more dominant in the region. Gideon was also instructed to sacrifice a bull to Yahweh on the altar, which, fun fact, is something people would do to worship Baal. And when you take that into account, something interesting can be found. You can almost see this as Yahweh stealing Baal's offering, or his worshippers, almost as if the deities are in competition with each other for worship in the nation of Israel. This idea is actually reinforced by another biblical story in the book of Kings, where priests of Baal have an actual competition against a priest of Yahweh. Maybe Gideon's story was written down around the time of this competition, or maybe after. Unfortunately, it's not entirely clear. Much more research has been done on Deborah because of how old her story is. But who knows what the future holds? History is always growing, and new theories are being pushed out every day. Anyway, back to the story. Gideon did sacrifice a bull to Yahweh at the altar, but he did it under the cover of night so no one would see him. When the sun rose, people in the town were outraged to see that the temple of Baal was now a temple of Yahweh. After some investigating, the townspeople concluded that Gideon was the one who did this, and they went to his father to seek justice. Upon learning what happened, Gideon's father said, "If Baal is so great, why can't he defend himself?" This question actually did stump the townspeople, and they decided to let Baal deal with Gideon himself. Nothing happened to Gideon, maybe Baal was too busy or something, so the temple remained a temple to Yahweh. And because of his desecration of Baal's temple, Gideon was given the nickname Jerubbaal. Nobody ever calls him by this nickname, the story still refers to him as Gideon. But keep it in mind, we'll return to the nickname at the end of the video. Once people started returning to worship Yahweh again, Yahweh let Gideon know that the Midianites were marching towards their location. At that point, Gideon sounded the trumpet to let the Israelites know of the invading army. And that night, Gideon asked Yahweh for a sign that he would win the battle. And Gideon asked for the sign to be shown on the fleece he left out overnight. The first morning, he woke up to find the fleece wet, while everything around it was dry. And then the reverse happened the second morning. Everything around it was wet, but the fleece was dry. Gideon knew Yahweh made it happen, and by extension, Gideon knew he would win. Did you see what Gideon did wrong there? So far, this is the second time he's put Yahweh to the test. The first was with the food in the basket, and now this fleece thing happened. However, Deuteronomy 6:16 clearly states that you're not supposed to test the Lord. Gideon is sinning directly against Yahweh to his face by doing this. But this is part of the overarching theme in the book of Judges. As the book goes on, Israelites no longer know the God they're supposed to worship, and they don't know how they're supposed to worship him. This will become an even bigger problem with future judges, but again, we're sticking with Gideon for this episode. The morning of the battle, Gideon has a massive army camped out at the springs of Herod. No, not that Herod. But Yahweh decides to trim their army down. He does this because he wants the Israelites to know this victory came from him, and not because of their overwhelming numbers. The army of 22,000 is shrunk to 300, and at that point, Yahweh says they're ready. Gideon waits until night to scout out the Midianite camp before attacking it, and when he decides he's ready, Gideon's army sets out under the cover of darkness. When they get to the Midianites, they set the camp ablaze, and unsurprisingly, the Midianites are terrified by the random fire that started. They wake up in a panic, and they're so scared they start turning on each other. The Israelites then chase the Midianites into the surrounding wilderness, and Gideon let the other tribes know that Israel was free at last. The tribe of Ephraim was mad that Gideon didn't invite them to battle against the Midianites, but Gideon's response boils down to, "You got your land back, stop complaining." Surprisingly, despite the sarcasm, the Ephraim stayed quiet after this talk down. Later, while Gideon was chasing the Midianites back to their own homeland, which is in modern-day northwestern Arabia, he demanded food from a city nearby on their chase. The city refused to give Gideon any food, and Gideon understood and respected their wishes, and no, I'm kidding, he didn't. No, he responded with a threat. Gideon said to them, "I will tear your flesh from your body with desert thorns when I return." That's a bit of an overreaction, but what makes it worse is that he says this threat to 2 separate cities, and he follows through with it. After capturing the Midianite leaders, he returns to those cities and sacks them too. Now this next part, you're going to see how Gideon has officially entered his villain arc. Gideon has the Midianites leaders captured, but it's not enough to kill them. He wants their son to kill them. The son of the Midianite leaders calls Gideon a coward and demands that Gideon kills the leaders himself. So Gideon obliges and he kills the leaders himself. And then I assume he kills the son as well, but the text doesn't say. After this victory, the Israelites ask Gideon to be their king, but Gideon says only Yahweh can be the king of Israel. He then melts down the loot received from the battles and sieges, specifically targeting any gold jewelry the people had. Gideon melts everything down and creates a new ornament for the temple of Yahweh. The temple remains dedicated to Yahweh throughout Gideon's life. But do you see what he did wrong again? One of Yahweh's first commandments is no idols, yet Gideon creates an idol to put in Yahweh's temple. Even if it's an idol dedicated to Yahweh, it's still an idol. The book of Judges also says that after his death, all of Israel prostituted itself at the temple. There are many directions we can go with that specific choice of word, but all of them are above the rating I've set for this channel, so we're just going to ignore that line. Feel free to imagine or speculate for yourselves though. Before Gideon's death, he had 70 sons, Hey, there's another instance of the number 7 popping up. These 70 sons were from many wives and concubines. One son is particularly important because he will be the subject of the next video. Abimelech was probably one of Gideon's favorite sons, because his name literally means "my father is king." Either Gideon was paying homage to his own father, or he liked the idea of being king himself, but he knew he couldn't declare himself as the king, even if people supported him. In the next part of this series, which you should stay tuned for, we get to see how Abimelech will ruin his father's legacy. Gideon later died in his sleep, and he was laid to rest in a tomb alongside his father. He, like many other judges in this book, symbolizes the meaning of the Book of Judges. This book shows how even though the people of Israel would eventually go back to God, they didn't know what he was like. Gideon tested Yahweh to make sure it was really him. And even though Gideon did what Yahweh said, he still fell short with pride and cruelty towards others. Sure, Yahweh said to drive the Midianites from their land, but did Gideon really have to chase them all the way back to their own city? Did he really have to capture them and demand the prince kill his own father? That wasn't just him defending himself. That was cruel and unusual punishment. Before ending this video, I want to briefly mention Gideon in the archaeological record. There's not as much to talk about here as there was with Deborah, but I still want to bring up something worth mentioning. Remember how I said that his nickname was Jerubbaal? Well, that name was found in an inscription dating back to the tribal period in Israelite history. However, this inscription probably wasn't Gideon, because the inscription itself wasn't found anywhere near where the story of Gideon takes place. Also, if you're wondering why Gideon was named after Baal, the very god he destroyed the temple of, the reason isn't exactly clear. Jerubbaal can mean either he who contends with Baal, or Baal is great. The problem is, we are not sure if the name was sarcastic or not. It could have been a nickname to honor Yahweh, because Gideon restored his worship in Israel, and Baal can be translated as Lord. Or it could have been a nickname given to make fun of Gideon. We're ultimately not sure, but I left an article in the description below if you want to learn more. Anyway, thank you for watching, leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want to see more. I have a Discord where I post memes and updates on future videos, and I have several methods of supporting me if you think I should get paid for what I do. So until next time, have a good one!